the Reform Manifesto is quite extreme and unachievable and scrutinise that quite extensively. I think the Green Party is the inverse of that on the left side of politics, where it's just full of completely impractical, crazy ideas.
What strike me about the manifestos, particularly the Labour and Conservative ones, actually, when you read the summaries of the two documents, if you didn't know which party which belonged to, they're not all that different. The Conservatives have promised to build 1.6 million houses. Labour have promised to build 1.5 million, or did I get those the wrong way around?
No, you're the right way around.
I got them the right way around.
But isn't
Do you believe
it? No, absolutely not for a second.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast with me, Tom Clougherty, my co-host Matthew Lesh, and joining us on the podcast this week, the IEA's Editorial Director and Head of Political Economy, Kristian Niemietz. Our goal is to bring you a public affairs podcast with a difference. We want to get beyond the headlines and the shallow political commentary you'll get elsewhere, and focus instead on the big ideas and foundational principles that classical liberals should care about. That may be a particularly hard promise to deliver on this week because we're talking about the political parties' general election manifestos, not necessarily the home of big ideas and foundational principles, but nevertheless, we'll try. We're going to talk in particular about the party's approach to tax and spend, to the planning system, to the National Health Service, and to regulation in general. Let's start with a rather general question. Kristian, Matthew, what do we make of these manifestos, and what do we make of manifestos in general?
Well, I thought they were about what I expected, so no big surprises there. The exception, perhaps, is the Reform Manifesto. That's the only one in which I saw some proposals that I thought, okay, I wasn't expecting that in that form. But the general theme is that every time I saw something that I liked, at least a little bit, it was always quite vague. And every time something is more specific, it's something that I didn't like. So that's broadly the division of Labour there, and across pretty much all of them.
Oh, and what do you make of it, Matthew?
Yeah, not too significantly different. I mean, it's probably worth just thinking about manifestos in almost a classic public choice framework, which is it seem to exist for their own kind of idiosyncratic reasons related to parties trying to appeal to specific constituencies. So you read through them and you can always sometimes feel the box ticking. You know, tick, we've said something about pensioners, or we've said something about young people, we've said something about, ethnic minorities. It's an effort to basically just have something that you're claiming to give each kind of subset in society. And then I suppose the second category, which you particularly got in some of the smaller party manifestos, some hobby horses, just some completely random policies. Clearly somebody within the political party has thought it's a good idea. They've been involved in the manifesto writing process. They got it in there, and that's it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. The something for everybody aspect of a manifesto. These things are probably not meant to be read from cover to cover and digested and taken to sort of embody the philosophy
I
of the
had been reading
movement.
them from cover to cover, and my mind has turned to mashed.
And we appreciate you doing that. But I think this is how they're put together. It's so that you can say, oh, what's your policy on X? What's your policy on Y? What's your policy on Z? And hope that there are no gaps in coverage. And I suppose for people like us, this is extremely frustrating, right? Because in a way, what you want to get when you sit and look at a manifesto is, okay, this is what it means to be a British Conservative. This is what they stand for. This is the ideas. These are the policies. And similarly for the Social Democrats in Labour or Social Liberals in the Liberal Democrats, you don't get that from modern day manifestos. You get this random sort of pick and mix of different policies, quite wildly varying degrees of specificity here and then extraordinary generality over here. This is not really policy thinking at its finest, is it?
Yeah, I think it says a lot about the state of each party, the nature of their manifesto. So the SNP manifesto, surprisingly short, sharp, compared to a lot of the others. Surprises me to say that. It was just a relatively short document. Not a lot of new promises, not a lot of commitments, just a few broad words about independence and the importance thereof, and some just a random small list of policies. The Lib Dem manifesto is obviously made by committee. It's made by, they have a national process where members vote on the policies in there. So it's just absolutely chock-a-block full of hundreds of ideas. the Green Party manifesto actually quite extreme, like in an under-acknowledged way. People obviously say the Reform manifesto is quite extreme and unachievable and scrutinise that quite extensively. I think the Green Party is the inverse of that on the left side of politics, where it's just full of completely impractical, crazy ideas. I think there's the expected regulations about bricks in there, which is a key. They want hedgehog holes in all new fencing, swift bricks, and bee corridors as a key Green Party manifesto, and I wish them well.
But in its own way, that is at least coherent. So they tell you a story, and you would get away from it thinking, okay, I now have a reasonably good idea of what this party is and what they stand for. And the reason, I guess, why the other manifestos are not like that is that this is just generally a time in which the parties can't quite make up their minds what they want to be. And it wasn't always like this. So in the late 90s with Blairism, so that was about the time that I first got interested in politics. Even though I didn't live in Britain at the time, I couldn't have named any specific Blairite policies. I think I could have given a summary of what the third way, Blairism, what that is. And there was just a bit of a story and idea they had about themselves. And that is just far less true nowadays.
Yeah. I mean, two things at a kind of macro level strike me about the manifestos, particularly the Labour and Conservative ones. The first is that actually when you read the summaries of the two documents, if you didn't know which party which belonged to, they're not all that different. Now, okay, the Tories want to cut national insurance, and you look at that and you think, okay, well, that's the Conservative one. Labour wants to raise VAT or introduce VAT on private school fees, so you can think, okay, well, that's definitely Labour. But if you take that out, on most things, whether it's the NHS, whether it's planning, whether it's regulation, the things we're going to come on to talk about, actually either manifesto could probably work for either party if you just painted it a different colour. So that's the first thing. The second thing I see is just an extraordinary level of risk aversion. So Labour is particularly strong on this. And look, we all see the opinion polls, so we know why. But it's very clear that this was a defensive manifesto. It isn't really designed to tell you these are the big ideas, this is what we're going to change about Britain. It's much more about, don't worry, there's nothing to be scared of. And I suppose the thing I wonder about there, when was the last time you had a big idea in a manifesto? It was probably Theresa May in 2017 with the so-called dementia tax, but
I know what you're talking about. There's the national service commitment from the Tory manifesto, the kind of vision the country needs.
Well, apart from that, no, I mean, you are right, and that one seems to have gone down a bit like a lead balloon. And in my view, and I think probably your views as well, thankfully so, sort of extraordinary that it was something that was assumed to be popular on the basis of some polling that was done. And then the polling that you've seen more recently suggests actually that is by far the most unpopular announcement that any political party has made. One may say serves them right. But I was going to say, Theresa May, 2017, the plan to reform social care and basically make people bear more of the cost of any care for themselves in old age and not put it on the taxpayer and effectively take it out of the next generation's inheritances in this case. Now, you can argue over the details of that policy. You can argue about whether it was politically wise, etc., etc. But it was nonetheless kind of a big idea. And they put it in a manifesto, and they got absolutely hammered for it. And it seems to me that if we look at manifestos now, expecting anything exciting, we're kind of fooling ourselves. Mm-hmm. The lesson was learned. Nothing controversial, nothing big.
Play the small target strategy.
Yeah, but they're also a bit like budgets in that sense that most of it is leaked before, and where we know before the budget speech what is going to be announced, and the purpose of them is just to have it all in one place. Yeah, and that's that. That is. And when you then come up with something really novel that nobody expected, then it gets risky. Then you get the national service problem. Well, the problem here is just that is even if it did well in some polling, the trouble is you can't really credibly pull that off if you've been in government for 14 years and then you suddenly say, okay, here's a radical idea that would change the lives of a lot of people. And it just doesn't connect with anything they've been doing so far. It's not that they've tried this before and failed or got distracted or overruled or whatever. This is something that you can't come up with just out of the blue and throw it at the electorate and say, okay, deal with it.
Here we go.
Shall we move on to getting some of the specifics?
Yeah.
Let's start with the proposals around tax and spend. I think it's probably been the part of the manifesto that got the most attention. Labour's been accused by the Tories of sums that don't add up, proposing several new tax rises, 5 new tax rises expected to raise about $7 billion, which is they want to fund some additional spending, particularly on schools and investments into green energy. On the other hand, the Tories have committed to cutting national insurance and a tax-cutting manifesto, largely paid for by dealing with tax avoidance, as well as cutting down on welfare spending. And at the same time, the broader question, I suppose, is about where this leaves the size of the state fiscally, which is that the analysis is showing no matter who wins, whether it's Conservatives or Labour, the size of the state will keep on growing. You're our tax expert here at Tom, so I'm keen to get your views on what's coming out when it comes to tax and spend.
Yes, well, I wrote a little bit about this in the IEA Sunday newsletter, and if anyone listening doesn't subscribe, they should at insider.iea.org.uk. But my basic point in that piece, and it was only a short piece, was that all of the tax policies are basically bad, right? In fact, I mean, my kind of main thinking in that article was you have a state that is growing, and you have a population which is aging, and you have all the mainstream parties basically refusing to acknowledge those facts, let alone think of any policies that could deal with them and kind of try and circumvent those pressures on state spending that are going to occur. On the other hand, you have that serious risk aversion, which means political parties want to rule out raising this tax and that tax, so income tax and national insurance and VAT. Both the Tories and Labour have both said we're not going to raise any of the 3 big broad-based taxes. The Conservatives have said they're going to cut national insurance. If you rule out raising any money from the taxes that basically contribute the lion's share of the revenue, and you also refuse to acknowledge the spending pressures on the state and come up with any realistic plan to deal with them, I think inevitably you start running down these kind of blind alleys of bad tax policy. And I don't want to pick on the Liberal Democrats because in a way they deserve credit for being more honest than the other parties in their manifesto and laying out precisely those weird, narrowly targeted tax increases that they might want to pursue.
Tech companies and share buybacks.
Tax companies and tobacco companies and tech and oil and gas, share buybacks, and Labour has something on VAT for private schools and private equity, carried interest, etc. There's a sort of widespread assumption that the next government will probably target things like pension tax relief, individual savings accounts, capital gains. I think the basic thing is here, though, that we have this sort of weird political economy at the moment where we're ruling out raising the big taxes. We're not going to do any broad-based tax increases. And of course, from a low tax perspective, I'm pleased with that. The problem is, I think the alternatives to raising those big broad-based taxes are actually worse.
Yeah.
And often it means taxes on investment, taxes on savings, taxes on specific industries. Or, actually, in the Conservative case, they're talking a lot about tax breaks for very specific groups of target voters, like landlords or pensioners. I mean, pensioners are basically the entire Conservative voting bloc at this point, so maybe that's not very targeted.
Yeah.
And there are a variety of other things in that field. I think what we're basically getting is A, a refusal to face reality about the size of the state, as you put it. B, a refusal to actually do tax policy in a principled, comprehensive way. And then, consequently, C, we're going to see increasingly these very silly, very targeted, a few billion here, a few billion there, but actually big deadweight costs. Completely out of whack with the amount of revenue that you're bringing in.
Yeah. The underlying issue here, of course, being the fact that they're not willing to cut back on spending. And,
clearly, yeah.
And it wouldn't be an issue that they are ruling out tax rises in some areas if the implication was that there wouldn't be any tax rises anywhere. But what they're really saying here is we're leaving some options open for tax rises, and where no one was committing, except perhaps Reform, committing to some very broad-based cuts. Yeah. Across spending, how they would actually achieve that isn't exactly clear. But no one's actually saying, I don't want the state to do this function anymore.
No.
And therefore, we're going to reduce the size of the state and we can reduce your tax burden along with that. And without that kind of a commitment, the trajectory is quite bad, right? Because you've got declining working age population, very big commitment on spending for pensioners in terms of the triple lock, like automatic commitments as a result of health and social care spending. And that you add on top of that, and this has been pointed out quite widely, particularly by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, that under the current government plans, non-protected budgets, which is to say budgets outside of healthcare, so for example, the Justice Department, is set for a real terms cut. And if you don't want to do a real terms cut, which Labour said they don't want to return to austerity, and the implication there is that they want to increase spending by £20 billion, and they haven't budgeted that anywhere with any of their spending plans. So perhaps because of all this, if there was economic growth and the economy was bigger and therefore there'd be more tax revenue, but you're kind of stuck in a position where the government's planned so much on the spending side, it's hard to see what they can do about it. I mean, what you make of this whole tax and spend malarkey?
Well, it will inevitably become a fiddlier system. It is generally agreed among economists, whether you're a big state or small state kind of guy, but I think most economists would just agree that ideally you should have a few simple taxes and standard rates, few exceptions, few deductions, and just a non-distortionary system. And that seems to have gone completely out of the window, because in the short term, it's always there's the temptation to deviate from that in order to tax specific groups of people or activities that are unpopular, and you think, well, you can get away with this. And it's true in individual cases. You can probably raise a few quid here and there, and most people won't particularly mind it, but you will inevitably then end up with a system that's a lot more complex and distortionary. The only silver lining, perhaps, about the whole tax and spend situation is that if they don't want to do spending cuts, and if they don't want to raise any of the big taxes either, that leaves regulation as the only venue, the only avenue in which they could maybe try to get some growth into the economy.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should turn to regulation. I want to make one more point actually about taxes before we move on, because I think there is something interesting in the Conservative commitment to get rid of national insurance, basically. And so I think what they've suggested in the manifesto is that the main rate paid by employees would be cut by another 2% down to 6%. Oh, yeah, 2 percentage points down to 6%.
Abolished for the self-employed.
The self-employed abolished altogether. Of course, they talk about phasing out national insurance. They never talk about the employer contributions. But if the Conservatives got their way, it doesn't seem likely that they would. But if they did, we might be in a world in 5 to 10 years' time where there were no employee-side national insurance contributions, and then you basically just had a payroll tax. So you had an income tax paid by workers and a payroll tax paid by employers. And would that be a sensible rationalisation? Possibly it would. It's something that governments have grappled with. Every sort of chancellor who's come into the Treasury, I think for years, has thought, why do we have two income taxes, one of which is called national insurance? Shouldn't we merge them? Shouldn't we script one? And so on. And so I think that is interesting, and it's worthy of note. And it probably would make, if it were implemented, for a more honest and straightforward tax system. So maybe some credit where credit is due there. On the other hand, it would actually move Britain quite out of line with most other countries, and particularly most other European economies, where they have quite high social security contributions, whatever name they go under, the equivalents of national insurance, on both the employee side and the employer side. And then, arguably, that allows them to keep taxes on investment much lower. I think this is one of the strange and underappreciated facts about European tax systems, that in many countries that we think of as high-tax jurisdictions, they kind of get away with it on the growth front because they load a lot of their tax burden onto social security contributions. That allows them to tax quite lightly on the investment front. And so I think there is probably a kind of sting in the tail of what is otherwise quite a nice idea from the Conservatives here, that if you kind of narrow down, in a way, the base for taxing incomes and earnings, maybe you exaggerate that other tendency that I just talked about of loading more of it onto businesses, more of it onto investment, more of it onto savings. We're probably not going to see this actually happen. But if it sticks around as an article of Conservative faith that we're going to phase out national insurance, I think that's something that's kind of worth keeping track of. But Kristian brought up regulation. Matthew, you've written about regulation recently in connection with the party manifesto. Should we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, let's go through it. So obviously, in this campaign, we hear a lot about tax and spending promises, and rightfully so. This is a £1 billion government, but I think that can distract from a lot of other roles and functions of government and costs the government imposes. So rightly so, I think we expect tax and spend promises to add up. There's costings, even if you can debate the accuracy of them. There are costings at the end of all the manifestos when it comes to tax and spend. There's just not the equivalent when it comes to regulatory proposals. And yet, so I've been going through the manifestos, and across them, there's literally hundreds of changes to regulation. Some of them, like the one I said earlier about BRICS, is quite trivial. Some of them are quite substantial. Environmental requirements, public health, public safety requirements, things that could really have quite large impacts on business, on economic growth, on prices, on innovation. One example that comes to my mind, which is quite telling, which is that in total, Labour's manifesto has about £7 billion in additional tax revenue measures. But just one regulatory measure, now there's over 60 in Labour's manifesto, which is to require all private rented homes to upgrade to what's called EPC C level efficiency, has been estimated previously by the government to cost £12 billion. Right. So that's a quite significant regulatory burden that they're placing. Now, indeed, it may be entirely justified change. The costs may outweigh the benefits. But what's quite interesting here is just the fact that no one is really asking these questions, or I should say almost no one except the IEA is willing to ask these questions about the regulatory measures across the manifestos.
And it's not just Labour, right? The Conservatives are doing it.
Yeah.
The Lib Dems are doing it. I mean, Kristian, what's your take on this? It always seems to me that we've actually transitioned from having a state that mostly taxes and spends to having a state which is mostly about regulation.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's exactly the problem. And that's why there is a problem with this inconsistency that we do, as Matthew said, that we do expect full costing numbers on tax and spend proposals, but not on the regulatory side, even though the two can be exactly equivalent. You could have a regulation that forces you to do something, or you could have a tax on you, which then pays the state to do the exact same thing. But from your perspective, they could be exactly equivalent. It's just if we do it in the tax way, it would be costed. If we do it in the regulatory way, it would not be. And there's just no good reason for that. Say, if we lived in, say, in Denmark, I'd probably be more comfortable with that approach, because Denmark is clearly a very high tax economy. But it is, by OECD standards, not that unreasonable in terms of regulation. So there it would make more sense to say, well, when it comes to tax measures, I really want to know the details. Regulation, I'm a bit more relaxed. Britain isn't that kind of economy. And some of the things that most hold back the British economy and have been for years are clearly on the regulatory side. We will, I guess, get onto that on the housing and planning side in particular. That's the bottleneck rather than the tax level, where Britain isn't really that exceptional anyway. And it's clearly the bottlenecks, the big drags on growth are on the regulatory side, and that's why we should be asking more questions about it.
Yeah, I think we're certainly not an outlier in terms of the total tax take, even though it's much higher than any of us would want. And we're not really an outlier, but we are below average, I think, in the structure of our tax system, and how neutral it is and how supportive of economic growth it is. It's clear to me that we could have a tax system which was much more pro-growth, but raised about the same amount of revenue, or even more revenue, actually, if you were politically unconstrained and you could go about this stuff in the right way. But even then, and Matthew very kindly described me as a tax expert, tax is the thing I focused on for a number of years, and I'm very passionate about it, of course. But I would have to say, I'd have to agree with you, Kristian, actually, that tax, let's pluck a number out of thin air, maybe it's sort of 10% of the growth problem. Most of the problem is to do with regulation. Right, I think it's planning, which is housing, but also infrastructure and also commercial property, and basically trying to build anything anywhere. It's energy, which is largely a regulatory problem as well. And then it's probably this kind of bureaucratization of previously high productivity industries like financial services and stuff in the UK, which has really taken off since the financial crisis, and I think is at least partly responsible for our flatlining economically over the last 15 years or so. But why don't we talk about the planning system? Because the Conservatives have promised to build 1.6 million houses Labour have promised to build 1.5 million, or did I get those the wrong way around?
No, you're the right way around.
I got them the right way around.
But isn't
Do you believe
no, absolutely not for a second. I think isn't the 1.6 million number? Isn't that just inner London, or is most of that inner London? Where they say we will rebuild inner London to the densities of Paris or Barcelona, which of course physically possible, but that would mean you would have to basically rebuild London from scratch,
right? Which
might not be such a bad idea, but there's no way they are going to do that.
No,
I mean it would be almost rational for the Conservatives to basically say, we're not going to win any constituencies in London. That's not exactly the case. They do, in fact, have constituencies in London. But let's say theoretically they're like, we're not going to win any constituencies in London. Let's just force them to build loads. And that way we just protect all our regional constituencies from any development.
There was a really interesting piece by Samuel Watling, yes, in Works in Progress magazine a few months ago. And it was basically a history of attempts to reform the planning system since the Town and Country Planning Act. And I think what becomes clear from that is that essentially lots of governments have had good intentions and similar ideas and come in with a lot of political will, and they've almost all crumbled. I mean, I can remember being on an IEA podcast or an IEA video before I worked here during the pandemic and talking about the Conservative government that came in 2019 and saying, well, look, even if they do nothing else except deliver on their housing plans, which I'm very confident they're going to deliver on, it'll be worthwhile. Right, and they completely failed. They crumbled in the face of political resistance. Actually, it seems to me, and I think, Kristian, you'll know the detail better than I will, but what Labour is proposing is kind of a reheat of things that have been tried before and which have just run into insurmountable political barriers. Are they being smart enough about this? Can they deliver on their promises? Will the supermajority that some of the polls suggest they'll get mean they can steamroller through the planning system and we'll all be cheering them as the pro-development, pro-housing Labour government? Or is it more complicated than that?
Well, I don't want to make predictions because you only make a fool of yourself in that way.
Yes, thank you.
The trouble is, but you're right. There's nothing fundamentally novel about what Labour are saying. This is basically an echo of what previous YIMBY Conservatives were also trying to do. There was Robert Jenrick after the 2019 election. There was Nick Bowles a bit more than 10 years ago. They had those intentions already. It was all there. And then they immediately panic when they run into some NIMBY resistance. What could be a bit different this time is that maybe... So far, the problem was that, say, you start with some YIMBY intentions, pro-development, pro-housing, you run into resistance, and even though it's just a small group maybe that opposes, there is no equivalent on the other side. So far, it would not have been a viable electoral strategy to say, I will try to cater to the YIMBY vote, because there was just no such thing as the YIMBY vote. It may have existed as a vague, abstract sentiment, but it would never turn into political outcomes in any way. You wouldn't have a setup where, okay, on one side you have the NIMBYs trying to shut something down, and there you have the YIMBYs saying, no, plow ahead with it. This is the right thing to do, and you have to see this through, even if it's unpopular in the short term. That was never there. There was no other side. It was always, there's the NIMBYs, and on the other side, there's just a void. There's nothing.
Just to add to that, I think it is actually quite extraordinary and quite welcome that the Labour Party is taking planning to be central to their message about economic growth and the election campaign.
Yep.
I think it does give them a stronger mandate in a way that in 2010, I don't think David Cameron's campaign was really about the plan. It was in there amongst promises, but it wasn't central. And the Labour Party, they've gone in a bit of trouble this week because an anonymous spokesperson said that they were going to bulldoze over the green belt, and then Rishi Sunak publicised that, and then Keir Starmer came out and said, no, that's not what we're going to do. But it does show, at the very least, that there is more determination. I'm not sure that this is always the issue, isn't it? That the detail adds up to it. I mean, everyone wants fast track on brownfield sites. That's as old as time itself. And they're going to restore housing targets. I mean, we had housing targets a few years ago. It didn't exactly solve the crisis. There's some more work being done, and I suspect influenced by the Britain Remade, around cutting infrastructure development planning time. And there's that both in the Tory manifesto and the Labour manifesto. Even the Green manifesto is very keen about making it easier to put up solar panels and wind turbines. So there is I would almost say like a growing political elite consensus in favour of planning reform. They will, as you've said, though, face the same issues once they get into Parliament. Although I think it's worth saying not as extreme. Their voters are genuinely younger and more YIMBY in the broad sense. At a local level, there's plenty of obviously NIMBY voters who are going to be supporting Labour, but in a broad sense, they don't necessarily have the same strength of opposition as the Tories. Of course, the temptation of Tories will be to oppose all the planning reform. Even planning reform they might have supported not so long ago, just because it'll be such an easy political win in their heads to push back against Labour. So, I mean, I think there is reason to be hopeful that perhaps, crisis won't be solved overnight.
And even if the resistance is just as extreme as before, it could be that this time it's going to be a bit more balanced. That even though Keir Starmer may not be a true believer when he says, oh yeah, I'm a YIMBY, I mean, it's very much a last-minute conversion. But nonetheless, it could just be that he builds up some expectation by doing this. And that therefore, when the clash necessarily inevitably happens, that there will be an expectation from parts of his electoral coalitions of people who say, well, but you have to keep going now. You can't just crumble just because in some marginal seat somewhere some NIMBY is moaning. You have to keep going. You promised us, and that he's thereby creating almost or waking up this latent YIMBY vote that wasn't there so far.
And I guess, two things really matter in policy change: ideas and interests. And I think it feels like we're making progress on both fronts when it comes to housing. Now, whether it will actually result in real policy change, I think remains to be seen. But on the ideas front, although it's far from perfect, there is a sense that everyone kind of agrees we just need to build more in Britain. And that the housing problem we have is basically a supply problem. There are some people who disagree, of course. And then on the interest front, I think, as you said, Kristian, it's always been a one-way street in the past. You have reformers and you have NIMBYs. You didn't have a pro-development lobby, an interest group. And maybe that's starting to emerge, and maybe that will make a difference. Let's hope so. Yeah. I'm not going to make any predictions like I did last time around.
Sure. Well, I kind of did in Home Win in the discussion paper. That was the because the reviewers what they also saying, well, okay, economically this is all sound stuff, like it, but come on, it's a bit unrealistic. And the way I tried to solve that was by willing a YIMBY coalition, a YIMBY electoral force into existence. I just said it just emerges in 2025. The YIMBYs suddenly wake up and they become a thing.
Yes.
And who knows? Maybe something like that will happen.
Yeah. A spectre haunting Britain, the spectre of YIMBYism. Anyway, let's move on to our final topic, which is the NHS. Interesting. Intractable problems. Kristian, you wrote about this. Do the party manifestos, say anything very different from one another about healthcare? And do they get to the heart of the problem?
Well, Conservative, Labour and Lib Dem are pretty much interchangeable. So the difference is just, say, in a blind test, if I just printed it out and removed the logos and everything and gave it to you and said, okay, tell me which is from which party, you would only pick it up from the tone, whether they say everything is brilliant now and we make it even better, or whether it's everything is terrible now and we'll totally turn things around. But say if you just pulled out, if you somehow made it tone neutral, no, you wouldn't guess which is which. It's really on different sides, the Greens and Reform that are a bit different. And the rest, the main problem isn't for me so much that you can't tell the parties really apart. It's that you can't even guess the year. Because there was one IEA paper a couple of years ago where I looked at older manifestos. What did the parties promise on healthcare in the 2000s, 90s, 80s? Because I wanted to look at whether what they promised during the election campaign, whether that has any relation with what actually happens later in health policy. And short answer is no, got nothing to do with that. But what I noticed quite quickly is that there are some things that just keep coming up again and again over the years. And they're in every election manifesto. So things like, we will better integrate services, or we will move care out of hospitals and into the community. And we'll make sure that care is better coordinated, and we will invest more in preventive care. And these are all things that you couldn't even tell, okay, is this from this year? Is this from 10 years ago? Is this from 1980? This just keeps popping up again and again.
And the point you made is that there are no mechanisms to make those things happen.
That's exactly.
And if there were easy mechanisms, would we not have used them when these things were first proposed in the 1980s?
I think what's quite telling is the Liberal Democrats' manifesto on this front, where they say we're going to create a new right to see a GP within 7 days, which sounds lovely, and it would be fantastic if everyone could see a GP within 7 days. But as you pointed out, Kristian, there's no mechanism to get there. There's no answer to what happens if you don't get a GP appointment within 7 days. Does somebody get taken out at gunpoint and they'll come to your home and provide you GP services? Like, how are they practically going about achieving the necessary capacity in GPs or the system of GPs, rather than just making something a right or just setting a target? It's a much harder question. I mean, we do get a lot that rhetorically Labour's shifted on the NHS, aka they're acknowledging the NHS is not necessarily perfect and does need reform, and they can't just keep spending more money on it. And they've heard a lot of that from Wes Reading, which I think is important and good, and very much echoes the work you've been doing for many years, Kristian. The problem here, though, as is usually the case, which is their answer seems to be largely kind of a technocratic changes within the NHS. So Wes Reading goes to Singapore. He sees they have really good IT systems. So he says, well, wouldn't it be great if the NHS got better IT systems? He doesn't go to Singapore and say they have personal savings accounts that better align incentives between people who are using healthcare with guaranteed support for people who can't afford it, but also people taking responsibility for the services they provide. Like the entire institutional structure in Singapore is different, which then explains why it's a more competitive system and it's got a better computer system. If you only think those technocratic terms, as we've had for decades in the NHS, where you get various reforms, some of them try to create market mechanisms within the NHS. Sometimes they're probably better than it would otherwise be, but doesn't necessarily again deliver the kind of more fundamental changes to the system. And what worries me about Labour is that they're still not willing to necessarily make those changes, because it would be outside of their political capacity or universe.
I think that you're identifying actually something that's a common theme in all the manifestos across all of the areas we've talked about and many that we haven't. There is an unwillingness to think about structural solutions to problems. The manifestos, probably government policies in general, just scratch the surface. And they're really unprepared to get into this line of thinking, which says actually the structures are wrong. The institutions and the incentives just don't work, and we really need quite radical rethinking if we're going to improve outcomes in this area, whether it's planning, whether it's the NHS, or whatever else. I think before we close, we probably should just say, well, Kristian, give me your take on this. Don't Reform actually have quite a good NHS policy?
They are, as I said, the only party that surprised me a bit. The only ones that had two proposals that are a bit outside of the box. One of them being healthcare vouchers. So if their plan is if you can't get an appointment within some time frame, you get a voucher that you can use for private healthcare. So that would be, say, what the Lib Dems are lacking with that right to an appointment within 7 days or whatever. But no mechanism. What happens if you don't get the appointment? Well, okay, Reform have a mechanism. They would give you that voucher, and that is at least a reasonably specific policy. And the second one is that they want to give people tax breaks for taking out private health insurance. So that will be more or less the system in Australia. They've had that for decades. The idea being if you're privately insured, you use the public system less, and you get a refund that more or less compensates you for that. The downside is that, again, as every time there's something in any manifesto that is quite good, there it's lacking in specificity. So, for example, here it's not clear at all with the voucher, where can I actually use this, and can I top it up privately? Things like that would matter, because it's not as if there was no private healthcare right now. The NHS does some contracting and outsourcing. It spends about 7-8% of its budget on buying care from private providers. That's a share that used to be much lower, went up in the first half of the last decade, and then 2015-16 or so, it just hit a wall, didn't go up anymore. So therefore, if you want to increase that share further, you would have to have some explanation. That's maybe specifically for Labour. That would be the question. They say we want to use the private sector to get the waiting lists down. Fair enough. But then what is their explanation why that share of private sector contracting just stopped going up? What's the obstacle? What's stopping NHS commissioners now from doing that? And if there is something stopping them, or if they're just somehow boycotted, if it's just the in-house NHS groupthink, what do you want to do to break out of that and get that share up? And as long as they're not explaining that, the vague promise of we will somehow use the private sector, that's not worth very much.
No. Well, I suppose vague promises that aren't worth very much could almost sum up our conversation about the party's general election manifestos, but let's call things to a close there. Thank you for listening and or watching this IEA podcast. If you want to learn more about any of the issues we've discussed today, there is a wealth of information available on tax, on healthcare reform, on housing and planning, and indeed on regulation at iea.org.uk. You can follow us on YouTube and various other social media sites, and I'd particularly encourage you to sign up for our relaunched newsletter and much more on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Until next time, thank you.